Hello, everyone. My name is Travariana Mason, and I'm a research associate here at National Black Women's Justice Institute. NBWJI is a nonprofit research, policy, and capacity building organization working to end the criminalization and confinement of Black women and girls. So before we get started, I just want to point people's attention to the globe at the bottom of the Zoom panel. Please click on that icon if you would like to see closed captions during the event. Again, thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We're excited to have this conversation tonight with Professor Roberts about her latest book. It's called Torn Apart, which focuses on the child welfare system and how it punishes and destroys Black families, and how abolition can build a safer world and will liberate Black communities. In 2018, the Kids Count Data Center found that although Black kids make up 14% of the US population, they are 23% of the foster care population. Research also finds that youth that are placed in foster care are at an increased risk of future involvement in the juvenile legal and criminal legal systems. Therefore, the child welfare system in this country, it not only polices and criminalizes Black mothers and families, it also increases the chances that Black youth, specifically Black girls, will be subjected to violence and harm inflicted upon them by the carceral system as well. With Professor Roberts' help, we will unpack what she calls the benevolent violence that the child welfare system carries out against Black families, and together imagine what abolition of that system could look like. This conversation is part of NBWJI's book club series, which spotlights books by Black women that explore the real impact of criminalization and incarceration on Black women and girls. Professor Dorothy Roberts is an acclaimed scholar, law professor, and social justice advocate. She's the 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Roberts is an award-winning author and expert on the interplay of gender, race, and class and legal issues concerning reproduction and the child welfare system. She has authored numerous articles and has co-edited a number of books on various legal issues. She is the author of Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, and Shatter Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, and Fatal Intervention. Her latest book was released this past April, titled Torn Apart. Tonight's discussion with Professor Roberts will be moderated by NBWJI's Executive Director, Dr. Sadie McKinney. NBWJI is so happy to have you all with us tonight. Professor Roberts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Thank you so much, Travariana. That was wonderful. Very excited to be able to bring more of NBWJI's team to the forefront, so you all get to meet them as well. Professor Roberts, I told you this before, I'm going to say it again. It is such an honor to have you here with us this evening. I am such a fan and appreciative of your research and scholarship and how you have elevated how Black women in this country have long been targets of state violence, particularly by the child welfare system. Torn Apart is excellent. And as I mentioned, before I came into this job as the executive director, I led data analytics at a large social service organization whose primary business was foster care. I entered that job wanting to improve the services and case management that Black families that are directly impacted by the child welfare system receive. But I walked away with a clear understanding of the harm it inflicts instead. Torn Apart does such a good job of naming the different forms of violence that the child welfare system leverages against Black children, families, and Black women. And I am so appreciative of your work because these issues are not elevated nearly enough in the academic and research communities. So I would love for you to share with us what inspired you to take up this research on the disproportionate impact of the child welfare system on Black families? And why do you think it hasn't garnered the same kind of attention as other issues that impact Black communities have?
Thank you. Thanks for those comments, Dr. McKinney, that really reflect my aims in this book. And it's always interesting to meet someone who has some experience with the system. Most people admit that it is a system that inflicts violence. Many don't want to admit it, but many do, and I appreciate that. So I became interested in this topic when I was working on my first book, Killing the Black Body, back in the early 1990s. And in that book, I was investigating the prosecutions of Black women who were pregnant and used drugs. And as you may recall, or you've heard about, I think many people have heard about the myth of the crack baby, which was a complete falsehood, claiming that these babies were going to become social pariahs and criminals and welfare dependent and couldn't learn. And that was part of the beginning of these punishments of Black mothers. And as I was focused on the prosecutions, I began to learn that an even wider punishment of Black mothers who use drugs was the removal of their children, their newborns at birth. And along with the prosecutions, there were what was then called border babies, babies who were taken at birth from their mothers because of one positive drug test, and then left in the hospital without any nurturing care, inflicting far more harm on these children than anything their mothers did to them. And I started to look into the child welfare system, and immediately, I was in Chicago at the time, immediately discovered that in Chicago, virtually every single family that was before the court with a judge deciding whether their children should be taken away, returned to them, parents' rights terminated, they were all Black families. And it was mostly Black mothers pleading, or their lawyers pleading on their behalf to let them get their children back. And then I looked into, well, what are the racial dynamics in this system, and discovered at that time, Black children were 4 times as likely as white children to be put in foster care. And the foster care population was huge, and it had skyrocketed based on the removal of Black children. Before Black children were being put into the system, when Black people were ignored by it, right? But then most of the money was spent on providing services to intact families. As soon as Black people started to enter the system, it shifted radically to foster care. And the main so-called service given to Black families was to take their children away from them. And the foster care system became, as you described, or maybe that was, I don't want to mispronounce her name, the wonderful person who introduced me. I just don't want to. Travariana, beautiful name. Travariana said harms, well-documented harms to children in foster care. So, but as you suggest, I've noticed where was the book on this? Where was the outrage? Where were the protests? I was so surprised to find out that there was such a segregated system, so obviously targeting Black people. And there had not been a book published since the 1970s. And of course, the system had changed dramatically since then. Foster care now, family separation had skyrocketed since then. So I thought, once I was done with Killing the Black Body, I said my next book is going to be about investigating this system and making the claim that this is a form of oppression against Black people. And that was a book I wrote 20 years ago, Shattered Bonds. Now, fast forward to today, I wanted to write another book. I was thinking on the 20th anniversary of Shattered Bonds, I was thinking about writing a preface and republishing the book. And so much had happened, and my thinking had become more radical about it. I now had engaged in lots of reform efforts, including a big class action lawsuit to reform foster care in Washington State. And it was clear to me, this system is designed to oppress and disrupt and destroy Black families and communities. And it just needs to be dismantled and replaced with an approach that truly supports families and cares for children and keep them safe. And also, there was now a growing movement to dismantle the system, which didn't exist when I wrote Shattered Bonds. And so I decided to write a new book, Torn Apart, that documented the harms of the system, also that focused more on its entanglements with prisons and police, and made a stronger case for abolition.
I think you definitely do that in this book. And it is interesting for you to talk about, the evolution of your thinking in 20 years from Shattered Bonds to Torn Apart, because I feel like Shattered Bonds feels a lot more academic in its kind of approach to talking about the issues. And this feels like a book that's really written by a person who not that you didn't understand them, but like you really are able to name the harm in a way that, like I said, as a Black person who worked in that system, I saw and felt, and it really resonated. I felt like it was the first time I'd ever read anything that told the story of what happens to people and families and children who are impacted by foster care, by Black families that are impacted by foster care, in a way that I've never seen it written before. And so I appreciate that so much. One thing that I've recently seen as I was preparing for today's discussion was I saw some articles that are saying, well, the child welfare system, it's not systematically racist in any way, because if you look at what's happening to Latinx youth, there isn't an issue of disproportionality, that the percentage of Latinx youth in the general population is actually just a few percentage points higher than in the foster care. And so people are saying, well, you can't say it's systematically racist if it's not also a problem that's impacting Latinx youth. I'm wondering what you say to those folks.
Well, first of all, it's anti-Black racist and it's anti-Native racist. So we know that you can't, it's simplistic to say, well, if it doesn't affect every non-white group the same, because you could say the same thing about Asian Americans. They also are, underrepresented in the foster care system. So it's just simplistic to say, well, if it doesn't affect every non-white group the same, it's not racist. Why is it enough to say it's anti-Black? That's racist. And we can see a long history of the use of child removal against certain groups for certain political reasons. Let's be astute and complex about this. This system targeted, or the approach of child removal and family separation targeted Black families from the very inception because of the way in which it could be used as a form of oppression against enslaved people. There's a reason why it was advantageous to enslavers to have control over Black families. So there's a political reason. We're not talking about prejudice in people's minds against anyone who isn't white. That's not the point. The point is that structural racism and white supremacy have a particular political purpose. I didn't know I was going to be giving a lesson on the politics and the meaning of white supremacy, but you always have to look at any kind of racist institution. How does it function? Any racist ideology, how does it function? And then look at the historical roots and understand its purpose today. And so there's a particular purpose of using child removal and family separation against Black people. We can trace that then to after the Civil War and how child apprenticeship laws, which were a form of court-ordered family separation, were used by white people to take back the labor of Black children, along with convict leasing and other forms of carceral regimes that took back the labor, forced the exploited labor of Black people after the Civil War in order to virtually re-enslave them. All right, the system worked out. We can look at child removal as a weapon of war used by the US military against Native tribes, and how then, after, into the 20th century, family separation through the formal child welfare system was used as a deliberate way of targeting Native tribes to assimilate them. And now this is a different form. This is also racism connected to settler colonialism, and a different kind of racism against Native people, which was that they could be assimilated into US culture by taking their children. That's not the attitude toward Black people. Black people cannot be assimilated into US culture. Black people are considered always in opposition to white people. We are the people who have to be contained and punished. Black women sterilized. Okay, so it's different when it comes to Latinx people and Asian Americans. They're discriminated against in different kinds of ways. And you cannot say that Latinx people are not victims of child removal, because they became victims of it when it was politically advantageous to use family separation as a weapon, as part of immigration policy. And in fact, many Americans were outraged at the policy of separating families at the border, especially under the Trump administration. They recognized this is a form of oppression, political oppression. They recognized, and there were briefs filed and experts who testified, that this is a human rights violation, even a form of torture under UN conventions. Okay, so we can recognize that then this happens to Black families on a regular basis, and we need to recognize it there as well. So, and also we can look at certain states, certain parts of the country where Latinx families are separated at higher rates than in other parts of the country. So this, again, this is a systematic form of political targeting that is rooted in white supremacy. It's also rooted in not anti-poverty, but anti-poor people ideology. It's rooted in discrimination against people who are poor, and in an ideology that's very present in the United States, that poor people should be blamed for their poverty instead of understanding the structures, including structural racism, that create poverty, that create income inequality and perpetuate it. So anyway, that's my lesson in understanding how white supremacy, any kind of political oppression works. It's not about prejudice in people's minds. It's about a systematic political use of certain kinds of institutions and systems to have a particular impact, disruptive impact on marginalized communities. And that's how we have to look at this. And definitely a long history. It's not an accident that the two groups that experienced family separation by the US government were people of African descent and people of indigenous descent, and they remain today the two groups that are overrepresented, that have in the foster care system that have the highest rates of investigation, child removal, and termination of parental rights to this day. It's not an accident.
I want to come back to something you said about how people were really up in arms about the removal of children at the border. And
Yeah.
when I looked through the table of contents of your book, one of the things that jumped out at me and I thought was so important is you have a chapter, it's chapter 2. They separate children at the Harlem border too.
Yes.
And I remember sitting in an executive team meeting and being asked, you know, should we be an agency that is, you know, receiving some of these young people who have been separated from their parents?
Mm-hmm.
And people were so adamant politically around, like, this is terrible. No, we can't.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we have no problem with separating Black children from their families, right? Like politically, it was just so antithetical to who they were to be a part of, you know, what they perceived as Trump's agenda. But this has been happening to Black families, and it didn't cross their mind at all about the similarities between these groups and their experiences of family removal and separation.
Yeah, so first I want to give credit to Joyce McMillan of JMAC for Families, because I got that, as I give credit to her in the book, from a billboard, you know, big poster she put up at a subway station in Harlem. And yes, referring to the fact that many Americans could understand the harm of tearing children away from their loving families, their family caregivers, and were outraged but have not shown that same outrage toward the much more common separation of Black children in Black communities, which has been going on for decades. And again, we could trace it all the way back to slavery and the post-Civil War era. So that's one point. The other is just to ask yourself or ourselves, you know, why is it that people would immediately see and document that it is traumatic to children to take them from their families? It's traumatic to their family caregivers. You know, I mean, we should just be able to understand that without having to see those terrible examples, that a child is going to feel emotional pain to be taken from the people who have cared for that child, and that their caregivers are going to suffer terribly not knowing what is happening to their child. I can't even imagine. I mean, anyone with children, that's the most terrifying thing you could imagine. And you know, even if you don't have children, you are a child, but you should be, you know, everyone should be able to imagine this. And it's well documented. Psychologists have shown it, and all of these studies came out. It's a matter of UN conventions. There are a number of UN conventions that even see family separation as a form of genocide if it reaches, you know, certain amounts. And some people have said it's reached that amount in the United States. And so why is it? And again, I go back to these stereotypes about Black families, and we can trace them back to the slavery era. The idea that was promoted during slavery that Black families, you know, Black people in general didn't feel emotional pain. And so when you take the families apart, you know, they weren't even seen as families. Enslavers legally owned every family member and could do whatever they wanted with them. And the idea that you could pull Black families apart without causing them any emotional pain or harm was promoted during the slavery era. And there are stereotypes about Black families that we can trace through every generation, that Black families are dysfunctional, we don't have caring relationships with each other. You know, you think about the stereotypes about Black mothers I started writing about this in Killing the Black Body. The Jezebel, sexually licentious woman who always wants to have sex. Of course, that was developed during slavery to excuse white men's sexual assaults of Black women. You couldn't rape a Black woman. That there was no such concept of that because Black women couldn't consent or not consent to anything done to their bodies by anybody. And then there was the Black mammy who was supposed to care only for white people's children. And of course, she had to be monitored. She was enslaved. So or after she was a servant to white people. She wasn't supposed to care for her children. What happened to her children when she was nursing and caring for the white people's children? No concern about her own children. And then there was, we could fill in, but another major one was the Black welfare queen or the welfare queen, who was always portrayed as Black, who was supposed to have children, not because she cared for children, not because she wanted to. She had children to get a welfare check. And then she spent it on herself, not on her children. She didn't care about, she neglected her children. The idea of one of the central racist stereotypes about Black mothers is that we don't care about our children. We just have children irresponsibly, and too many of them, and we don't care about them. That is like the quintessential stereotype about Black mothers in America. And then, I mentioned already the crack baby during the 80s, early 90s, the crack baby myth that Black women were trading sex for crack, which this was written in newspapers, deprived Black mothers of maternal instinct. So they had no maternal instinct, didn't care about their babies, harmed their babies, and then, abandoned them. That was the other thing that was said in the papers. They were abandoning their babies. Not that their babies were taken from them, they were abandoning their babies. Just all of these stereotypes that send the message that Black mothers do not have caring bonds with their children. And so then when you hear that our children are being taken from us at these high rates, it doesn't have the impact of on the public because there's a sense that there's no damage. In fact, there's a very strong idea that Black children are better off away from their mothers and their fathers. Of course, the stereotype, of course, is the fathers aren't around anyway. They're just impregnating women and they don't have any relationship with their children. And therefore, take the children away. It's no harm. They must be better off. And this is another reason why, even when you hear about the documented harms to children in foster care, I think many people think, well, yeah, they're harmed in foster care. Yeah, they're, high rates of imprisonment after foster care, but they were damaged by their Black mothers to begin with. And so they're still better off than if we left them in their mother's care. And I think that, that I believe is why that, and also just not knowing the statistics and what goes on in the system, people were outraged at this family separation at the border of Mexico, but not the border of Harlem and every other Black neighborhood in America, impoverished Black neighborhood in America. I guarantee you will find that is where most of the child welfare agency involvement is going on in any big city in the nation.
There were so many things that you just said that I think are so important to lift up. But the first thing that comes to mind to me is, and I really appreciated the way that you described this is benevolent violence.
Yes.
Early on, I remember, I was really interested in the juvenile court system. And so they were the child savers.
Yes.
And today,
right.
And they were, these were really the same, similar issues, right? Young people who were neglected by their working parents.
Yeah.
And so the juvenile court is taking them, removing them from their homes. And as you described, being put to work, right? That was what was happening to young people and Black folks, particularly, and immigrants.
Yeah.
And then today we have what you're calling benevolent violence, which really rung clear for me, because I remember people saying, like, these are families that are in crisis, right? Like, the work that we are doing, these young people are being removed, these Black children are being removed, but their families are in crisis. And so we are stepping in to support the family.
Yeah.
And the truth is, we are tearing away their children, asking them to show up and do work towards reunification, but you just took my kid away, with very little explanation. And also you're putting me through the rigmarole, which you described in the book, right? Like, it's just jumping through hoop after hoop. And the kind of work and that parents have to do to be reunited is so hard. And I don't think people understand the hoops that they have to jump through. And if you take too long to start planning, then people will say you're not planning. And then your risk of your rights being terminated increases.
Absolutely.
And with ASFA, what is that? The American Families
Adoption and Safe Families Act. Yeah.
Yes. They shorten the timeline, right? So now you have even less time as a
15
parent.
months. 15
exactly.
months. Yeah.
And you have even less time, and you're still being asked to jump through these hoops. And it is just so hard and you're not engaging with families in a way that is actually supporting them. It is only, for lack of a better way of talking about it, pissing them off and making them resistant to even want to work with you. And their resistance is towards the system, not to reunification.
Right.
And sometimes folks give up because it is so hard. And
every word you said is so true. So I actually use the term benevolent terror in the book. I call it violence as well, but I have a chapter called Benevolent Terror. And to be clear, I'm not saying it's actually benevolent. If you read the chapter, you'll see what I'm saying is they claim that this is a benevolent system, but it's actually terrorizing families. And this is how it's designed. And this is the problem with it. It is designed to accuse, to investigate, to punish, to supervise, and eventually, in too many cases, to completely dismantle the family, to tear it apart. And that is not how you support people. You don't support people by punishing them. You don't support people by accusing them. The whole system begins, the whole process, right, begins with an accusation. So you're already starting from what's wrong with these parents. And that's the whole philosophy is, if this child has unmet needs, and by the way, most of the children separated from their families are separated on grounds of neglect, not a physical or sexual abuse. Physical and sexual abuse nationally is about 16% of the cases in foster care. The rest mostly has something to do with poverty, because neglect is defined as failing, basically failing to meet the needs of children. Some statutes list, not providing food, not providing medical care, education, clothing, housing. Well, parents don't provide that because they can't afford it. It's not because they're deliberately depriving their children of these needs that they have. And so if you have a family with unmet needs, the approach isn't how do we meet your needs? The approach is, we are accusing you of harming your child. And now we're going to investigate you. And from the very beginning, we're threatening to take your children away. And either we take them away and here's what you have to do to get them returned, or you do these things, or we will take your children away. And as you pointed out, it's a list, sometimes cookie cutter list, not even geared toward the family's needs. It's it's already printed out. And in fact, in many places, it's a form, and the caseworker may check off what you have to do. And almost always, one of the things checked off is parent training classes, because the idea is you're homeless because you don't realize that your children need a home. So we're going to train you into this realization, or therapy, the forced therapy. And any trained psychologist would know you cannot force people into therapy and it be truly therapeutic, especially when that therapist can testify against you in court about some quirk in your personality that means your children have to stay in foster care. And so it's threatening. It's all based on threats and investigation and accusation. And as I said, the ultimate threats of we'll take your children, and if you don't comply in time with everything, that is grounds to terminate your relationship with your child. And so termination of parental rights has become about meeting a schedule. It's not about, will this child be unsafe returned home? What can we do to provide for this family so they can stay together? It's, did you comply with everything on the list? And any lapse can be grounds for terminating parental rights. Now, it doesn't, some people have said to me, well, in most cases, parental rights aren't terminated. That's true. It is, I suppose you could say, relatively rare, but it's so drastic. It happens too often. It happens most often with Black and Indigenous families in America.
I also think it doesn't happen because when folks go to court, the judge says, you as a case planner haven't done enough.
Right.
So I think there is an effort, but I think not that one of the things that people do recognize is that case planners need to do more work to support the reunification, and that doesn't happen. And so you'll find, even though we have these ASFA timelines, it keeps getting pushed down the line because the work on the part of the agency has not been sufficient. I did want to move us to talking a little bit about the ways in which women who are directly impacted by the child welfare system can become entangled in the criminal legal system. And you provide this really great story. I can't remember the woman's name, but that her child was removed. She had never had any contact with the police until then, and then there was a ripple effect down the line of continued contact.
Yeah, well, this could actually be several women, but I'll mention one. Her children actually weren't removed, but one that I begin my introduction to the book with is a woman named Vanessa Peoples, who was a nursing student in Aurora, Colorado. And she was undergoing tests for leukemia. She had anemia, frail, thin, but she was making it through nursing school. She had 2 little boys, and she was at a family picnic with her little boys. And her cousin was watching the younger one. And when her cousin left the picnic, the younger one followed behind her into the parking lot. Now, Vanessa noticed this right away, and she grabbed the older boy, and they were 2 and 4 years old, older one, and ran after him But before she could catch up with him, a woman passing by saw the toddler in the parking lot and called the police. Vanessa gets to her within a minute. She gets there. The woman is on the phone talking to the police or 911, whatever. And Vanessa says, that's my son. The woman will not give the boy back to her. And again, Vanessa is, ailing. She's not ready to fight this one. She just says, I'll wait till the police show up and get my son back. First, the police didn't want to give her son back. The family had to come and vouch for her. And he writes her a ticket for child abuse because her son traipsed away for less than a minute. Okay. They go home. A month later, a caseworker shows up at her door to investigate her. She is down in the basement cleaning up, and the little one, same little boy, is at the window looking out on the front door. The caseworker, because Vanessa hasn't answered the door, she didn't hear it, calls the police. 3 police officers arrive and they go into her home. One of them gun drawn as Vanessa's coming up the stairs. They start interrogating her. She's saying, please leave my house. You see, my children are fine. They're healthy, happy boys. They're fine. And they start interrogating her. You didn't answer the door. What if you had a heart attack? What if you were sick? She says, I am sick and you're not helping me. She stood up to them. Well, then she calls her mother to come because, she's upset. The mother comes, asks them to leave. The mother takes the 2 little boys, goes to their bedroom, and a police officer stands in the door and says, you cannot be alone with your grandsons. Starts yelling at her. Children are upset. The grandmother's trying to help the children. Vanessa says, let me get in there and see my children. He says, no, you can't. She says, what do you mean? This is my house. I can't. She's done nothing. She's done nothing. He grabs her by the neck and throws her down. This is all on video cam, with the police cam. Throws her down. 2 other officers tackle her. They dislocate her shoulder, pulling her arms behind her, handcuff her arms, shackle her legs, and then chain her together. Her arms, it's called hobbling. It's like hog tying. All right. By now, 7 police officers have arrived in her home. They take her out. They inspect her entire house. You can see them with the body cam opening the refrigerator, opening the cabinets, take her to the hospital because they've dislocated her shoulder, and now charge her with additional counts of child endangerment. Okay, now she's got a criminal record of child abuse on her record. This stays on her record. She's got a year of supervised encounters with her children. Fortunately, they didn't take her boys away from her. Sometimes they will take the children, right? But they come to her house to unannounced visits to supervise how she's engaging with her children. She's got to go to family parenting classes, the whole 9 yards. And of course, this disrupts her education as a nurse. She finally graduates from nursing school. She cannot get a job as a nurse now because she's a registered child abuser. Again, from her little boy traipsing away momentarily at a park. She's tried to get an apartment. She's living with her mother, trying to get an apartment for her and her children. Can't get an apartment because the landlords look up her record. She's a registered child abuser. I mean, this has disrupted her employment, her education, her livelihood, her ability to live in the city. Not to mention the trauma of being hogtied, brutalized by police officers, and her children witnessing this. Her children are terrified of the police. She's terrified of the police. All of this is supposed to protect children. It's an example, though, of how quickly they call the police in Black neighborhoods. And I talk about in the book that connection with the police. Also, I tell the story of a young man who was shot to death by a police officer during a child welfare investigation. The child wasn't even in the house. And the police end up shooting this unarmed man to death right in front of his home. And then the cases where children are killed by police or by staff in these residential facilities, which detain both children in foster care and children in the juvenile justice system together under this carceral approach to children. My point isn't that children in foster care shouldn't be with children in the juvenile justice system. It's that no child should be in these places where they're treated as if they are in prison. And those are just some of the connections. But, Black people are already at risk when we are encounters with police officers. We know that. I think the public is aware of that now. And this adds another layer of encounters in a very volatile situation because they're coming in to take people's children away. And, it's the sign of a loving parent that they resist. They don't want their children taken from them and put with strangers or put in a facility that you don't know what's going to happen to your children. Or you do know because you've experienced yourself, or you have neighbors and friends, relatives who've had this experience. Or, again, just in general, the idea of government agents coming into your home and taking your children away. It's a terrifying situation. And talk about a volatile situation. I think some people may have even seen the video of Saisha Mercado, a former American Idol contestant who brought her son to a hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida, because she was pregnant and he was 13 months old and she wanted to transition him from breastfeeding to food, solid food. And he wasn't doing well on that. He was dehydrated, she could tell. She brought him to the hospital for care, and they accused her of child neglect and took custody of her little boy. And so now she has a baby, and she's now under supervision of the Manatee County Child Protective Services. And this is where the video, her partner live streamed on Instagram what happened. The car's pulled over by armed sheriff's deputies, and they say, hand over your baby, 10-day-old baby, nursing. They have not harmed this baby. The baby's perfectly healthy, happy with her mother and father, loving family. They order her to turn over the baby. It's the most heartbreaking. I think your book club can look up the video. Heartbreaking. She goes up to these three white women who appear to be the social workers, the case workers, to turn over the baby. And she's, this is my baby. How can you do this? Do you have no heart? How can you do that? How can you take a little 10-day-old baby away? And she was forced under, armed sheriff's deputies to turn over her baby. And fortunately, partly because she was known as an American Idol contestant, there was some publicity around what was going on, the live streaming of this. She had a good legal team, and she was able to get her baby back 9 days later. But 9 days for a newborn baby to be separated from her mother, that causes real harm. And for the mother, I can't even imagine someone taking a newborn baby away. I just imagine they'd already taken her toddler away. Eventually, they were able to get the toddler back too. But you do wonder, what if they didn't have a high-powered legal team? And again, that's not to diminish the harm that was inflicted on them. None of that should have happened. There is just no way you could say that system protected her children. They harmed her children. And that's just, I could go on with the stories. That's just a couple of the stories that I tell in Torn Apart of Black mothers who are just demeaned, humiliated, devalued, brutalized. If there's time, I'll just tell one more because I think it reveals a lot. A woman named Angeline Montalban in New York City, who was experiencing violence from her partner, and she snuck into the bathroom early one morning to call a domestic violence hotline she had seen advertised in a bus, and told them she needed help. Could they provide a place for her to go? And when she told them she had a 2-year-old son, all of a sudden the voice of the person on the other end changed and started interrogating her. They didn't provide her any help. She hung up the phone. The same morning, this was early in the morning, caseworker shows up at her door, wants to inspect her little boy, inspect the home, and charges her with child neglect because she was the victim of domestic violence. No evidence that any harm had ever happened to her little boy. And they didn't take him with supervised visits, the whole thing, court appointments. She took out an order of protection against her partner, but she didn't. And then they said, you have to take out one against him for your son. And she said, but he hasn't ever harmed my son. And I want him to be able to see his father, because if she took it, the father could not even be near him. Okay, I want him to be able to visit with his father. Okay, that violated the rule. The father brings the boy, they tell the father to bring the boy to court and leave him in a daycare center at the court. And they take the boy away and put him with a stranger in foster care. It was like the way they do it, set up. She's at work and she gets a call. We put your son in, can you imagine? It's just, your son is living in another borough in foster care. It took her 5 years to get him back. 5 years. And the reason she got him back was because they had it out for her. Every time she complained what was happening to him in foster care, he was being abused in foster care, they took it against her. And finally, they moved him to another home where the foster parent had a heart and said, this little boy wants to go back to his mother. And finally, they returned him to his mother. And Angeline is now an activist against the system.
I
But
think Angeline is actually with us today.
Are you serious? Angeline! More power to her, a fierce activist. And so it just shows you that this is not about protecting children. It's about punishing families. And if, like Angeline, yes, she is my inspiration. If you resist, that's the thing, that's the really, I say they call parents pathological. This is the pathological thing about this system, is that if you resist, if you are an advocate for your child, that's held against you. You're a bad Black mother because you're angry they took your child. You're a bad Black mother because you're fighting for your child. You're a bad Black mother if you complain about the abuse your child is experiencing in foster care. That makes you rebellious, and that means you don't recognize your own deficiencies, because this whole thing is about Black mothers' deficiencies, not their strengths. Their strengths are interpreted as deficits. It's sick. It's sick the way that operates. And so that also, just another aspect of this is when people say, oh, but how will we keep children safe? Well, Angeline was acting to keep her child safe, and she was punished for it. And then her child is made unsafe by putting him in a foster care system with strangers. So it deters. In so many ways, it deters efforts that would be supportive, that would keep children safer. And I think what happens with mothers who are survivors of domestic violence is a perfect example of how, instead of providing what would keep both people, the mother and child, safe, it intervenes in a way that makes both less safe. And I quote in the book a Black mother who said, this is not Angeline, but a Black woman said, I should have just let him beat me because they took my child away. I would have preferred that. Of course, so this is the thing about abolition. Abolition is, no, don't keep people in unsafe situations. Let's have a system, not a system, an approach, a whole approach that doesn't have the harms of the system we have now, and does a better job of supporting families and keeping children safe. It's not about abandoning families. This is what people say. They hear abolition and they think, oh, you're just going to end what little we have to keep children safe and have nothing. No, that's not what abolition is. It's so interesting that people hear abolition today and they'll say, oh, it's just pie in the sky, or it's utopia, or these people just are imagining and they're not doing anything. All the abolitionists I know are working to create a new system. I keep saying it's not a system, it's a new approach, because it's not like creating another system to replace it. It's about transforming lots of systems, actually, and a whole different approach. And I think about, well, when we think about abolishing slavery, I mean, don't you support abolition when it comes to enslaving Black people? We talk about abolition, that means dismantling chattel slavery and creating a democracy, which we're still creating today. Like, it's a long-term process, but you first have to work toward dismantling the oppressive chains, unchaining people as you are building a free society. That's what abolition is. And it's because of people who either don't understand or don't want it to happen, it has gotten this really wrong-headed narrative about it, that it is just about tearing things down. But if you read or listen to or participate in any abolitionist organizing, it is just as much about building up the replacement.
we're running over, but I just want to say, appreciate you ending there, because the other thing that I hear people say about why abolition is so hard for them to wrap their heads around is, well,
Yeah.
what's the alternative?
Yeah.
And I think this juxtaposition of, well, we abolished slavery, and at that time, people probably couldn't imagine a world
Yes.
where slavery didn't exist.
Yeah.
And yet they still continue to push and
Yes.
fight, and look at where we are today.
Right.
And so it is about being able to imagine what are the kinds of support that we believe that all families deserve,
Yes.
and making that available, right?
Yeah.
Instead of policing, surveilling, monitoring families and people,
Yes.
certain people, it is about, we have done this, people. We have reimagined something new. We are
Yes.
living it. So why can't we bring that same kind of creativity and thinking what a new approach to supporting families could be like in this country?
Absolutely. You said that very well. Absolutely.
I just want to say thank you so very much for joining us today. It has been such an honor to hear just your brilliance as a person who is a fan. I'm sure I'm not the only one, but I am fangirling here to have been in conversation with you.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And I've noticed that the chat it says 99 plus. So and I'm sorry I couldn't engage in it, but I can only imagine that it's a great chat and dialogue going on. So I'm so happy about that as well. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed this conversation and I appreciate it. And I appreciate reaching your book club audience as well.
Yes, and thank you. I'm so happy that when I reached out a year ago, you were like, wait, I've got something else. And so thank you so much. And thank you to all of the people who joined us. Sorry, Bob, we all want a Q&A, but I also want to respect people's time. So maybe if you want to shoot some questions to information at NBWJI, maybe we can support getting some responses out to folks. But we really appreciate everyone who joined us today. We appreciate the energy, the enthusiasm, and all of just the thoughtfulness that has been shared in our chat. And the impact of the intersection of child welfare and criminalization is an important one. This will not be our last conversation. We will be talking about this again, maybe with Professor Roberts and others.
I will come back. Yeah, seriously, if you want me to, we could focus on that and probably have a full program as well, right?
So we will do a part 2.
Okay.
And so thank you everyone so much. We really appreciate you and have a lovely evening.
Thanks everybody. And thank you so much, Dr. McKinney. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This is amazing.